2, yeah. And that would be what books? 1st and 2nd Peter. How many books did Paul write? 13. We don't know who wrote Hebrews. If Paul wrote that, then he wrote 14. But we know he wrote 13 of the New Testament books. Now here's an interesting thing I just want to pass on to you. Paul, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, writes that he is the chief of sinners. He mentions that twice in his writings. I'm the chief of sinners. And what that means is, I'm the worst. There's nobody can claim that they are a worse sinner than I am. Because I persecuted the church. He was a Christian killer. And under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, he says, I'm the worst of sinners. I'm the chief of sinners. So everybody else has to fall in rank behind Paul. You know what that means? If God can use the worst sinner and get him saved and have him write 13 books of the New Testament, what do you think he could do through you? If God would choose to use a man who was the worst sinner to be saved, and he would use him to start churches and to get the gospel spread to the key areas in the first century. In fact, without the work of the Apostle Paul, the other apostles, did little compared to what he did. And the gospel went to Europe and eventually to our ancestors because of the work of the Apostle Paul. And so if God hadn't saved him, look how many people would not have come to know the Lord, including me. Now, if God could use the guy who was the worst, what could he do through you? Do you think he could take the gospel further into some unreached or very little reached, less reached areas of the world through you? I don't know why not. And Paul says, this grace was shown to me, the worst of sinners, as an encouragement so everyone would know what God could do in saving you. I just think that's very important for us to remember. Now here's a timeline of Paul's life. The timeline of his life. And we're going to kind of just use the book of Acts because that's the history book. And we're going to just hit some highlight chapters in the book of Acts. And so on your chart that you have, and I didn't page number these, but on your chart that you have, outline of the life of the Apostle Paul, all right, on the one side is a date, 30, 35, 37, so on like that. And then the middle is the event, and then at the far right is the chapter, the Acts reference, the chapter in Acts that you can read about that. So that's the way the chart is set up. And so the first line would be AD 30, and the event talked about in Acts chapter 1 is the death and resurrection of Christ, and then the commissioning of the apostles, the ascension of Christ, their waiting in Jerusalem, and their appointment of Matthias. I didn't put all that information on yours here, but if you want to write some of that down, this is where Jesus ascends to heaven in Acts chapter 1. And remember, the apostles are all looking up in heaven like this. And then two men in white apparel say, "Why are you men standing here gazing up into heaven like that? This same Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven shall so come in like manner as you've seen him go." And the implication, stop looking up and start looking out. He's got something for you to do, a commission He just gave you. Go into all the world and preach the gospel. And so that's what happened with that. It also, in Acts 1, you have an appointment of Matthias. And then in chapter 2 is Pentecost, and Pentecost is the birthday of the church, and especially for the Jews. Okay? Especially for the Jews. And so they were all waiting in Jerusalem according to Jesus' instruction, waiting for the promise. And what was the promise that Jesus gave to them that they were to wait for? The Holy Spirit, the coming of the Holy Spirit. And He said, you wait for that in Jerusalem. So they were all waiting, and suddenly the place where they were was filled with a mighty rushing wind. The word for wind and the word for spirit is the same word in Greek. It's the word pneuma. So you have a pneumatic tire. What does it mean you have, Phil, if you have a pneumatic tire? One full of air. All right. At least it should be. And if you have pneumonia, you are having a problem with air. All right. And that has to do with your breathing. And so the word pneuma is the word for spirit, and it's also the word for wind. And the only way you can tell which is meant is by the context. And so Jesus said that the wind blows where it wants to you, and you hear the sound thereof, but you don't know where it comes from and where it's going to go. And so is everyone who is born of the Spirit. Now, you don't catch it in English because we've got the word wind and the word spirit. But He was using the word pneuma, and it's a play on words. And He was just saying, you don't know where the Holy Spirit is going to blow on someone's life and someone's heart, and they come to know Christ as their Savior. You just don't know who that's going to be. But it'll be where the Lord wants it. And so, in Acts chapter 2, you have the birthday of the church, but especially for the Jews, because these were God-fearing Jews and others that were met on that day and in Jerusalem. All right, and in chapter 9 and a year 35, you have the conversion of Saul, and his name will be changed to Paul. So we're just going to put that in parenthesis. Now, Paul gives some information about these years, these next years, and he gives a more complete account in the book of Galatians and chapter 1. And so beside beside Paul in Damascus, Arabia and Damascus, put Galatians chapter 1. And I guess I did put it on the screen too. Galatians 1. And it'll help to fill in some of the details of he went here and he went there, and then 14 years later he went here and he went there, and it will help to fill in the details of what happened in the early life, or the early part of Paul's Christian experience. And then in years 37 to 43, Paul is back in Tarsus, and Tarsus is his hometown. Tarsus is Paul's hometown up in Asia Minor. It's a coastal city. And then in 46 to 48, those years, you have the first missionary journey. All right? You have the first missionary journey, and you read about that in what chapters of Acts? 13 and 14. Okay, now I thought I'd give you a map of that. And so the first journey starts out with Paul and Barnabas. And it starts out in the text to say Barnabas and Saul, Barnabas and Saul, Barnabas and Saul. And you get partway through this journey, and now it's Saul and Barnabas, and Saul and Barnabas, and then Paul and Barnabas. So he starts out with top billing and winds up with second billing. Because he emerges in this first journey, he emerges as the leader of the group. Now they take someone else with them, and he's a cousin. to Barnabas. And you know what his name was? John Mark. Okay. And John Mark, I think it was at Perga. They got to Perga, and John Mark deserted them and went back home. Probably to Tarsus. He went back home. I don't know why. The text doesn't say why, but there was some kind of a problem, and he goes back home. Yeah, it was Perga. At Perga, and Perga is right up here. At Perga, John Mark goes back to Tarsus, and he goes back home. All right, so they continue on up into what is Asia Minor today, and they go to several places. There are two Antiochs that are important in the journeys. Antioch of Syria becomes the missionary sending center and kind of is home base, we can say, for the Apostle Paul. They always come back to Antioch in Syria. And you'll notice right here, this is Antioch in Syria. There's another Antioch, it's up here. Okay, so don't get the two mixed up. But they start from Antioch. It's kind of like the sending church. And they leave there and they go on a missionary journey. When they come back and they give the report to their sending church there at Antioch. It becomes a missionary sending center for all of the missionary journeys. Okay. And why did they go to Cyprus? Because that's the homeland of Barnabas. Barnabas was from Cyprus, so they went back to his old stomping ground. And then they go through several places, and then they return back, go back to Antioch, and give a report to the church. All right. And then after that,